Hey everyone, James here. Today, going to be talking about Italian genre films here again on this channel. Today, I am going to be reviewing a film and going to be talking about one of the stone cold classics of the Giallo genre, a film that if you are tuned into this channel, you undoubtedly have at least heard of, if not seen. I'd be very surprised if people have not seen this. And that film is 1963's Blood and Black Lace. This film, of course, has been circulating for a while. A lot of people know about it already. It has recently kind of got a little bit more circulation amongst maybe more of the film buff audience that isn't specifically into Italian genre film. On the Criterion channel, it is there's been a Criterion collection of kind of different Giallo films. I think there's 13 or 14 there. A lot of them are the big classics, so things like Bird with the Crystal Plumage, Tenebrae, some of the big Argento ones, as well as this film, Blood and Black Lace. But there's also kind of this nice mix of other films that maybe are a little bit more underneath the surface that people haven't seen. I'm forgetting what the one, In the Folds of Flesh, that's the one. That's kind of the deep cut, very, very weird odd pick, and I was very happy to see it because the Giallo genre has a lot to offer. It's not just necessarily the films like this one that are sort of canonized that are worth watching. I think if people are into, there's just a lot to explore and a lot for people to enjoy. Of course, not everyone's going to like those beyond kind of the main classics, but I think some people will, and I would include myself there. But anyways, we are not going to be talking about In the Folds of Flesh today. We're talking about Blood and Black Lace. So this film, in many ways, and I will talk a little bit about this later, could be considered kind of a blueprint and a sacred text, not just for the Giallo genre, but for maybe the most famous Italian horror film director, Dario Argento. This film comes out 7 years before he makes his debut, but I think you can really see the linear arc from this film to Bird with the Crystal Plumage. It almost skips over those 7 years in between, because the Giallo being created kind of in that in-between period after Blood and Black Lace and Bird with the Crystal Plumage are kind of their own thing. They're a little bit more influenced by things like Diabolique and whatnot, so you have a bunch of Lindsay films and things like that. But kind of the mold and the template that would be created is really started here with this film, even though I think most people would not consider this the absolute first Giallo, but it's perhaps like the first early one that really, really informs the later genre. Should and why to watch this? Yes, you should absolutely watch this. In my opinion, this is a stone cold classic. Not only is it hugely influential, but I think this is a great film. This is not one of those films that you're just like, oh yeah, you should probably watch it for the influence, but does it hold up? In some ways, there are a couple areas that you could potentially knock this film, but in my opinion, this is absolutely a great film. It's a great film then, and I think it's a great film now, too. It also is a great showcase for Bava's different strengths, which are similar, but not exactly the same as Argento. So things like the technical aspects that Argento is really good at, the visual direction, Bava is also similarly good at. He came first as well, so the colors, the camera movement, those things are not at all subtle in this film, but they are definitely kind of the chief appeal for this film. I wouldn't say this is like the absolute best starting entry point for a Giallo. I'd probably say Bird with the Crystal Plumage is a bit better in terms of entry point. I like this film more, actually, but this film would definitely be in kind of the next 3 to 5 that I would recommend people check out if they're kind of getting a introduction to the genre. And Mario Bava, in many ways, can be seen, in my opinion, he's definitely one of the best Giallo directors, but he can sort of be seen as the grandfather, the creator of this genre. And he really, really did define the genre, especially in this film. And unlike Argento, who, like, especially in the Animal trilogy and some of his later Giallo too, he tended to, like to make the same sort of movie over and over again. He made a number of Giallos. Bava didn't repeat himself as much, so even though he is cranking out a lot more movies than Argento, it's interesting that The Girl Who Knew Too Much, which is sometimes credited as the first Giallo, came out just a year before this and this film. They're both are very visually dynamic, but they're visually dynamic in very different ways. And so I think it's interesting that Bava just varied himself quite a bit more, where he's like creating all this different things. And in between those two films, he directed 2 other kind of classic Italian horror films in between, Black Sabbath as well as The Whip and the Body, another film that I've really come around on that I didn't initially like as much. So one way that The Girl Who Knew Too Much, you could argue, might be a little bit have a little bit more of kind of like standard appeal to is the characters you have a little bit stronger of a character attachment. You're following people around a little bit more. Letitia Roman's character there, as well as John Saxon's. In this film, especially the dub, I think you can definitely, if you're going to criticize this film, you could talk about the dialogue a bit and some of the acting that could be described as wooden. I've actually come around a bit on the acting, and I do like some of it, but Mario Bava was never a great dramatist. The visuals and things like that are far more of the appeal. So actually, for me at least, I've enjoyed this film more and more every time I rewatch it. I think part of that is because I know exactly what type of film it is at this point. It doesn't necessarily have the dramatic chops to be like super propulsive, but that's not necessarily what I'm looking for as far as like a rewatchable films. That being said, there are several films here that you're like, wow, what did I just watch visually? And I'm rewinding it. And I mean, I've seen this film 5 times at this point, and I'm going and I'm like, I'm just kind of in awe of some of the camera work and the set pieces that he's doing, and I'm rewinding it and just watching it kind of immediately. So the synopsis of this film, which I've read to do, is basically it's sort of a body count film. You have 5 or 6 kills. They are all kind of spread apart too, so it sort of has that familiar set piece body count feel where a character and a set piece occurs basically every 15-20 minutes where someone is getting knocked off. The place where I think this shines a lot too is it's all done on kind of this fashion world. I've seen it described as sort of a plastic surface, which I think works really, really well. It has this great opening credit sequence too, where we have people being arranged sort of like a dollhouse. And in some ways, you can kind of see this as Mario Bava's dollhouse, where he's playing around with these different characters, where they're all sort of miserable and dislikable in their own ways, and he's just kind of moving them around. And you could sort of say that could be some sort of criticism towards the fashion industry too. So yeah, in the end, to kind of circle back to some of my earlier thoughts too, this film is very, very different from The Girl Who Knew Too Much. One obvious difference is that film is in black and white. This film has the absolute most vibrant colors that are popping like none other, very comparable to kind of the work that Hitchcock was doing in some of the Technicolor films of those time, stuff like Vertigo. And I actually recently watched a film from the same sort of era from Seijun Suzuki, Tokyo Drifter, which was a rewatch again. And for some reason, that film just doesn't quite work quite as well as this film does, even though they have a lot of the same strengths of like stylistic things and whatnot. I think part of that is just because I think this film is on another level in terms of camera movement and things that are happening. The filmmaking itself is so dynamic and so many different things going on. And to hear that Bava was doing this all, couldn't even afford a dolly, is doing it all on like a little children's red wagon, basically just taping the camera there. It just makes it all the more impressive. So let's see, a couple other things that really stood out for this film too are I kind of forget, just because this film comes so early and we think about genre, we think about how genre tends to evolve and we tend to push the extreme. Sometimes it goes in a more comedic direction. Sometimes things are just pushed into a more violent or sexually suggestive suggestion, something that definitely did occur in the Giallo. But watching this, you're like, okay, it's a 60s horror film, so you go in with a certain set of expectations that would be a little bit different than if you're watching something from the 1980s. But the horror set pieces in this are very cruel. Not only are they really impressively staged, but there's a certain big overall cruelness to them that I had kind of forgot about. I'm also reminded a little bit of kind of like the Gothic genre that I think in many ways is sort of the predecessor for these Giallo. There are times when we're going into kind of like these castle dungeon-like settings that would not be out of place in a Gothic film, which would most likely be in black and white. Nonetheless, they're shown here, and we show like burnings. There's a lot of sadism. For me, at least, one of the set pieces that really stands out is the one in the antique shop, which I think might be my favorite one. Here, Mario Bava uses very, very simple techniques, but it's perfectly blocked. There's a strobing effect going on where we have this great set design, great killer design as well, with the stocking over his head and like the white face just moving in and using kind of the different lighting and stuff to move and eventually attack and kill the person, kill the woman he's stalking. But also just like the different weapons and things kind of from medieval times. It's extremely impressive. Another one that really stood out too is the way that the camera zooms in when one of the characters comes home and ends up dragging a body inside as well. We are spoiling this film too. But it's just so many of the visuals are things that like linger in my head and are not only impressively staged, but actually pretty cruel, certainly for the time period, and I think certainly predictive of kind of where the genre would go. Argento, of course, would use things like the knife and the black glove killer to great effect. You have a little bit less of that here, but you are still having some very, very mean-spirited set pieces there. So really, you see kind of the just the blueprints of both the Giallo genre as well as the slasher one taking place. It's also a very, very sophisticated plot. I mean, like, if you've seen this film, you kind of know that too, where we have the double killer. It's all hinged in like a fair bit of irony, as a lot of Bava films are. But we have kind of the setup where one killer is basically establishing another person's alibi, and something that would be repeated very cleverly in something like Scream. But this film came much, much earlier, and I think is pretty sophisticated and quite surprising the way it's done. So I think in that sense, it holds up super, super well, and is not only surprising, but is a very good film in its own right. A couple other things we have here. I do feel like the film score I do like. It's done by Carlo Rustichelli. I think it does feel a little bit more old-timey than the 1970s scores. So I think what happened in the 70s is Argento really updated the formula. Even though 7 years had passed, culturally the 70s were a very different time than something like the 60s. So kind of this old-timey, slightly gothic feel of Blood and Black Lace is replaced with a little bit more kind of hipper music. Eventually that would be replaced by even hipper music with something like Goblin. And so, yeah, that's kind of how I see the sort of linear progression from this to something like Bird with the Crystal Plumage. It's also really interesting to think about the life cycle of these films. This film, of course, I'm sure looked great when it was first in theaters, but it was not a success at all. And so this film was, according to the commentary by Tim Lucas, was released as a VHS that immediately sold out in 1999. It's interesting because like this film now has been restored. It's in 2K, it's in 4K, and it looks absolutely phenomenal. But imagine watching this in like an old 1999 TV on VHS. Things are much, much better now. So, I mean, I think we really are in kind of like the second golden age of things like Jolly. I think films like this really, really, it's much easier to appreciate them when you can watch them in a good home entertainment setup with great, vibrant, popping colors rather than something like an old VHS. So thinking about how much better the technology is to watch these films at home now, 25 years later from when this first came out in 1999. Okay, well, I think that just about concludes my thoughts on Blood and Black Lace. Sorry if it's a little scattered. It's been a little bit since I've recorded a review. I tend to record a bunch at once and then kind of slowly release them over the months. But I'm going to say Mario Bava won this film, giving it a 9.5 rating. This is definitely one of my top 3 to 5 Jollies, depending on my mood. There's a couple Argentos I like just a little bit more. Deep Red and Tenebrae are usually my 1A and 1B for Jolly. But I think this film is absolutely one of the highlights and the best in the genre. Not just because of its influence, but because it's a fantastic film. So thank you everyone for tuning in. I will see you all next time.